Victoria Hanks had always lived in the fast lane of the city. A rising star in urban agriculture and a consultant for high-tech greenhouses, she thrived on deadlines, constant noise, and the thrill of competition. But when she received the news of her grandfather's passing and the unexpected inheritance of his sprawling rural farm, something shifted in her. The farm was a place she barely remembered from her childhood, a quiet patch of rolling hills, a small lake and miles of fertile soil surrounded by a sturdy wooden fence. It wasn't just land, it was a legacy, a symbol of her family's resilience through decades of economic hardships. At first, the thought of moving to the countryside seemed absurd, but Victoria couldn't shake the idea. She'd been burned out, disconnected, and craving something real. So she made the leap. When she arrived at the farm, it was as though she'd stepped into a different world. The house was worn but solid, its paint peeling from years of neglect, and the fields had grown wild, overtaken by tall grass and weeds. The fence surrounding the property was weathered, its wooden planks bending under the weight of time, but it still stood. Victoria felt a strange sense of calm as she took it all in. For the first time in years, there was no honking traffic, no crowded office meetings, just the sound of the wind brushing through the trees and the occasional chirp of crickets. Determined to honor her grandfather's memory, Victoria set to work almost immediately. She began clearing the overgrown fields, learning how to repair the dilapidated fencing, and planning what she would grow. Her ambitious mind couldn't resist turning the farm into a project, a potential model for sustainable agriculture. It was an enormous challenge, but it gave her purpose. The first few weeks were exhausting but fulfilling, and she found herself relishing the physical labor. It wasn't long, however, before she began to notice the cracks in the idyllic vision of rural life. The first crack came in the form of her neighbor, Karen Barlow, a woman who seemed to have made it her mission to know everyone's business. Karen introduced herself within hours of Victoria's arrival, walking right up to the porch uninvited with a basket of cookies and a thin, overly friendly smile. She was dressed immaculately, her blonde hair pulled into a tight bun, her manicured nails clutching a clipboard. "Welcome to the neighborhood," Karen said, extending the basket as though it were an obligation rather than a gesture. "I thought I'd come by and let you know how things work around here." Victoria, wiping sweat from her forehead, glanced at the clipboard. "Thanks. It's nice to meet you," she said cautiously, taking the basket. Karen didn't wait for an invitation to continue. "So, you're the one who inherited the old Hanks farm. It's such a shame it's been sitting like this for so long. You must be overwhelmed with all the work ahead of you." Victoria shrugged. "It's a challenge, but I'm getting the hang of it." Karen smiled thinly. "Well, if you ever need help or advice, I'm just next door. I run a little garden project, and the community really values the land around here. It's important to use it wisely." Something about her tone made Victoria uneasy. There was a sharpness behind the polished exterior, an unspoken judgment. But she smiled politely and thanked Karen before excusing herself back to work. She didn't think much of it at first. Neighbors could be nosy, after all. As the days passed, Karen's presence became more frequent and invasive. She'd appear unannounced, peering over the fence, offering unsolicited advice about land management or casually mentioning that her family had lived in the area for generations. "I've always thought this land had so much potential," she said one afternoon, leaning over the fence as Victoria pruned a row of shrubs. "It's just such a shame to see it underused." Victoria began to dread the sound of Karen's voice. But the turning point came when Karen brought up the fence itself. "You know," Karen began casually, "these old boundaries don't always reflect the true property lines. I think there's some overlap between your fields and what might be community land." Victoria stopped what she was doing and turned to face Karen directly. "The boundaries are clear," she said firmly. "I've seen the deeds." Karen's smile didn't falter, but her eyes narrowed slightly. "Well, if you say so. I just think it's important to keep things friendly. People don't like feeling shut out, you know." Victoria's unease grew with each interaction. Karen's comments seemed harmless on the surface, but there was an undercurrent of something more insidious. She began noticing Karen walking her dogs along the edge of the property, sometimes letting them wander past the fence into her fields. Victoria politely asked her to keep them out, but Karen just laughed. "They're harmless," she said, "and it's not like they're hurting anything." One morning, Victoria awoke to find Karen standing just inside her property line, surveying the fields with an appraising look. When Victoria confronted her, Karen waved it off. "Oh, don't mind me. I was just admiring the view. You're so lucky to have all this space." It was then that Victoria realized Karen's friendliness wasn't just neighborly nosiness. It was something more deliberate. The remarks about property lines, the casual invasions of privacy, the way she seemed to treat Victoria's land as though it were up for discussion. Karen wasn't just interested in small talk. She had an agenda. Victoria decided she'd had enough. She started locking the gates, keeping her tools and equipment secure, and making it clear that she wasn't interested in Karen's advice. But Karen didn't take the hint. Instead, her behavior became bolder, and Victoria began to suspect that Karen's interest in her land wasn't as innocent as it seemed. It was just after sunrise when Victoria discovered the first major sign of trouble. She had started her usual morning routine of walking along the perimeter of the property, inspecting the fence, and making a mental note of any repairs that might need to be done. The fence was old but sturdy, a critical barrier protecting her newly planted crops and the small vegetable garden she'd started cultivating closer to the house. Halfway through her walk, Victoria noticed something strange. A section of the wooden fence had been cut clean through, not splintered or weathered from age, but sliced with precision. The jagged edges of the cut wood suggested someone had used heavy-duty tools to sever the boards. As she stepped closer to examine it, her stomach sank. On the other side of the gap, deep tire tracks were etched into the dirt, leading directly to her field of young plants. Victoria followed the tracks, her boots crunching against the soil. The trail led to a flattened patch of her garden, where several rows of carefully tended seedlings were now trampled into the dirt. Next to the mess, she spotted paw prints, large ones accompanied by smaller holes dug into the soil. A wave of anger surged through her as she pieced it together. Karen's dogs. The realization hit her like a slap. Karen's comments about potential and her constant presence along the fence line hadn't been idle chatter. This was deliberate. Someone had cut through the fence and allowed those dogs onto her property. Victoria's mind raced as she tried to process the blatant violation. She immediately pulled out her phone and took pictures of the damage, the clean-cut fence, the tracks, the ruined crops, and the paw prints. She needed documentation. Furious, Victoria walked back to the house, dialing the local sheriff's department. The dispatcher listened politely as Victoria explained the situation and asked for an officer to come by. But when she mentioned Karen, the tone of the conversation shifted slightly. Do you have evidence that your neighbor was responsible for the damage?" the dispatcher asked. Victoria hesitated. She didn't have footage or witnesses, only her suspicions and the history of Karen's behavior. Not directly, she admitted, but this isn't the first time she's crossed the line. And I'm sure her dogs. "Without clear evidence, there's not much we can do besides file a report," the dispatcher said, cutting her off gently. "We can send someone out to take a look, but it sounds like a civil matter more than a criminal one." Defeated but not deterred, Victoria agreed to file the report and hung up. She wasn't going to let this slide. As she paced the kitchen, trying to think of her next move, a sound caught her attention. Looking out the window, she spotted Karen standing just outside the damaged section of the fence. Her dogs were with her, running freely through the open field. Victoria stormed outside, her anger boiling over. "Karen, what the hell do you think you're doing?" Karen turned to face her, smiling as if nothing were wrong. "Oh, good morning, Victoria. Isn't it beautiful out today?" Victoria ignored the pleasantries, gesturing toward the fence. "Did you do this? Did you cut my fence and let your dogs in?" Karen feigned surprise, tilting her head innocently. "I'm not sure what you're talking about. The fence looked like that when I walked by this morning. I just assumed you were having it repaired." "Don't lie to me," Victoria snapped, her voice shaking with fury. "Your dogs have been running all over my property, destroying my crops. I've seen the tracks, Karen." Karen's smile tightened. She placed a hand on her hip, looking unfazed. "You know, Victoria, I think you're overreacting. It's just a fence. And as for the dogs, they're just being dogs. You can't expect them to understand property lines." "This isn't about dogs," Victoria shot back. "This is about boundaries, Karen. You have no right to cut my fence or trespass on my land." Karen's expression shifted, her tone suddenly colder. "Boundaries? That's an interesting word coming from someone who doesn't even understand the history of this land. Did you know that this area used to be open to everyone? My family has lived here for generations. We've always had access to these fields." Victoria's jaw dropped. "That's ridiculous. I have the deed to this property. It's legally mine." Karen shrugged, her voice dripping with condescension. "Legal doesn't always mean fair, does it? Maybe you should look into the history before you start throwing accusations around." With that, Karen called her dogs and walked away, leaving Victoria standing by the broken fence, seething. The audacity of her neighbor was almost too much to comprehend. It wasn't just the damage, it was the way Karen acted like she had a right to Victoria's land, as if her presence was more legitimate because of some imagined historical claim. That evening, Victoria took action. She reviewed every document she had related to the property, the deed, old surveys, and notes her grandfather had left behind. Everything clearly showed the boundaries of her land, all legally registered and uncontested. There was no ambiguity. Whatever Karen was trying to claim had no basis in fact. Determined to secure her property, Victoria spent the next day reinforcing the damaged fence, replacing the broken boards with stronger ones, and installing a temporary lock on the gate nearest Karen's property. She also began researching security cameras and motion detectors to monitor the perimeter. But just as she started to feel like she was regaining control, another unsettling discovery pushed her frustration to new heights. Returning from town with supplies, Victoria found a laminated sign staked into the ground just inside her fence. The bold letters read "Community Access Path Open to All Residents" beneath it. A smaller note claimed that the area was designated for shared use, citing vague legal jargon that made no sense to Victoria. Victoria ripped the sign out of the ground and threw it aside, but the message was clear: Karen wasn't going to stop. This wasn't just petty harassment, it was an escalation. Victoria realized she needed to act decisively, or she risked losing more than just her crops. She contacted a local attorney, explaining the situation in detail and sharing the pictures and documentation she'd gathered. The attorney listened carefully and offered practical advice. First, you need to install cameras. Get clear evidence of any future trespassing or damage. Second, keep documenting everything. The more records you have, the stronger your case will be if this goes to court. Victoria agreed and set the plan in motion. But even as she took steps to protect herself, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. Karen wasn't acting alone or on impulse. There was something calculated about her actions, as if she had a larger plan in mind. Whatever it was, Victoria vowed to stop it before it got out of hand. The first sign that Karen wasn't going to back down came the following morning. As Victoria walked out to check the reinforced section of the fence, she immediately noticed something was off. A thin trail of white powder stretched along the fence line, scattered haphazardly across the soil. At first, Victoria thought it might be fertilizer spilled by mistake, but as she leaned closer, a sharp chemical smell hit her nose. It wasn't fertilizer, it was something entirely unnatural. Concerned, Victoria called her attorney and described what she had found. The attorney suggested photographing the powder and notifying the local environmental agency. "It's better to be cautious," the attorney said. "If she's dumping chemicals on your land, that could be a serious violation." Victoria took detailed photos and bagged a small sample to send to the agency for analysis. She wasn't entirely sure this was Karen's doing, but given the escalating pattern of harassment, it seemed likely. Karen had made it clear that she wasn't afraid to push boundaries, and Victoria was beginning to suspect her neighbor was testing just how far she could go before provoking a serious reaction. Her suspicions were confirmed later that afternoon when she noticed Karen standing near the fence, this time accompanied by two unfamiliar men. One of them carried a clipboard, while the other took measurements with a laser device. They were pointing at her fence, discussing something in hushed tones, and didn't bother to stop when they noticed Victoria watching from her porch. Victoria wasted no time. She grabbed her phone and approached them, her voice firm. "Excuse me, what exactly are you doing on my property?" Karen turned to her with that same infuriating smile. "Oh, Victoria, I didn't expect you to be home. These gentlemen are surveyors. I'm having the property lines reviewed for accuracy. There's been some confusion about the boundaries." Victoria's stomach churned with anger. "There's no confusion. I have the deed and the official survey. This is my land." Karen waved a dismissive hand. "Oh, I'm sure it's just a formality. You know how old records can be. They're not always reliable. It's better to have everything checked, don't you think?" The surveyors avoided making eye contact, continuing their work as if Victoria wasn't even there. She could feel her patience wearing thin. "You don't have permission to conduct any surveys on my property. Leave now or I'll call the police." Karen's smile faltered, replaced by a steely glare. "Victoria, there's no need to get hostile. I'm doing this for the good of the community. Everyone around here knows this land was always shared. You're the only one making things difficult." Without another word, Victoria pulled out her phone and dialed the sheriff's department. Karen and the surveyors exchanged uneasy glances, but they didn't move until Victoria began describing the situation to the dispatcher. Only then did Karen sigh dramatically and wave her hand for the men to pack up. "This isn't over," Karen said as she turned to leave. "You'll see that I'm right." Once they were gone, Victoria felt a mixture of relief and dread. Karen's persistence was unnerving, but what worried her more was the legal implication of the survey. If Karen was planning to dispute the property lines, it could turn into a prolonged battle that drained Victoria's time, energy, and resources. She couldn't afford to let that happen. Determined to get ahead of whatever Karen was planning, Victoria visited the county records office the next morning. She requested copies of every document related to her property, hoping to find something that might explain Karen's claims. The clerk was helpful, but the search turned up no surprises. The boundaries were exactly as Victoria had known them to be, and there were no records of any changes or disputes. Feeling somewhat reassured, Victoria decided to take additional precautions. She contacted a local contractor and arranged to have the fence reinforced with steel posts and barbed wire along the top. She also ordered motion sensor cameras to be installed along the most vulnerable sections of the property. It was an expensive investment, but she knew it was necessary. However, Karen's next move was even bolder. Just days after the survey incident, Victoria woke up to find a section of her garden completely dug up. The neat rows of vegetables she had been carefully tending were destroyed, the soil turned over as though someone had plowed it during the night. Among the wreckage, she found broken stakes and fragments of cheap plastic fencing, evidence that someone had tried to install something there and then hastily removed it. Victoria was furious. She checked the footage from the few cameras she had already installed, but the angles didn't capture the garden clearly. All she could see were faint shadows moving in the distance, too indistinct to identify. That evening, she heard voices coming from the fence line near Karen's property. Peering through her window, she saw Karen talking to a group of people, neighbors. It seemed gesturing animatedly toward Victoria's land. Though she couldn't make out the words, the tone was unmistakably accusatory. The following morning, Victoria received a letter in the mail. It was from a lawyer representing Karen. The letter accused Victoria of encroaching on community land and demanded that she remove her fence within 14 days to allow for proper access. The tone was both formal and aggressive, implying that Karen intended to take legal action if Victoria didn't comply. Victoria immediately forwarded the letter to her own attorney, who assured her that Karen's claims were baseless. Still, the threat of legal action added another layer of stress to an already volatile situation. As if that weren't enough, Karen began a campaign to rally the neighbors against Victoria. Flyers appeared in mailboxes throughout the area, claiming that Victoria was blocking community progress and selfishly hoarding resources. Some neighbors, likely intimidated or swayed by Karen's forceful personality, began avoiding Victoria altogether. Others offered quiet words of support but made it clear they didn't want to get involved. It felt like a siege. Every day brought a new provocation: a knocked-over trash can, a mysterious pile of debris dumped near the fence, or the sudden disappearance of tools Victoria had left in her shed. She couldn't prove Karen was behind these acts, but the pattern was too consistent to be coincidence. Victoria's attorney advised her to remain calm and document everything. "The more evidence we have, the better," the attorney said. "Don't let her bait you into a confrontation." That's exactly what she wants. Despite the advice, Victoria couldn't help but feel the strain. The constant vigilance, the isolation, and the relentless harassment were taking their toll. But she refused to give in. Karen might have been loud and aggressive, but Victoria had something her neighbor didn't: the truth. And she was determined to use it. The mediation meeting was supposed to be a formality, a structured environment where both parties could present their cases under the supervision of a neutral mediator. Victoria hoped it would finally put an end to Karen's relentless campaign of harassment. She arrived at the small office in town armed with every piece of documentation she could find: property deeds, boundary surveys, photographs of the damage Karen had caused, and even the letters from Karen's lawyer demanding access to her land. Karen, of course, arrived with her usual air of self-importance, wearing an impeccably pressed blazer and carrying a binder that looked more for show than substance. She didn't bother to acknowledge Victoria as she entered the room, but her smug smile as she sat down spoke volumes. The mediator, a calm and composed woman in her 50s, began by explaining the process. Each side would have an opportunity to present their case, and the mediator would attempt to help them reach a resolution. "This is not a court proceeding," she emphasized. "Our goal here is to resolve this amicably and avoid further legal action." Victoria went first, laying out her case with precision. She explained how she had inherited the land, provided a detailed overview of her property rights, and presented evidence of Karen's repeated trespassing and damage to her crops. She described the chemical powder along the fence line, the broken stakes left in her garden, and the surveyors Karen had brought onto her property without permission. When it came time to show the boundary survey, Victoria handed the mediator a copy and carefully explained how it aligned with her deeds. "The property lines are clear," she said firmly. "There's no ambiguity here. Karen's claims about shared land or historical rights are baseless. This is my property, and she has no legal right to access it." The mediator nodded thoughtfully as she reviewed the documents. "Thank you, Ms. Hanks. You've provided a thorough account. Now, Ms. Barlow, it's your turn." Karen cleared her throat and leaned forward, clasping her hands as if she were about to deliver a heartfelt plea. "Thank you," she began, her voice dripping with faux concern. "I'm not here to make enemies or cause trouble. My only goal is to preserve the community and ensure that this land is used in a way that benefits everyone." Victoria bit back a retort, forcing herself to remain silent as Karen continued. "The problem," Karen said, casting a sidelong glance at Victoria, "is that the boundaries in this area have always been fluid. My family has lived here for generations, and we've always understood that certain parts of the land were shared. It's not about ownership, it's about tradition and mutual respect." Karen opened her binder with a theatrical flourish, pulling out what appeared to be a hand-drawn map. It was old and tattered, the lines faint and uneven. She slid it across the table toward the mediator. "This map was passed down to me by my grandfather. It shows the original boundaries of our property, long before these official surveys were done. As you can see, a significant portion of what Ms. Hanks claims is hers was actually part of our family's land." Victoria couldn't stay silent any longer. "That map is meaningless," she said, her voice sharp. "It's not a legal document. It doesn't prove anything." The mediator held up a hand to calm the room. "Let's focus on the facts. Ms. Barlow, do you have any official documentation to support your claims?" Karen hesitated, the first crack in her confident demeanor. "Well, no, but this map reflects the truth of the situation. And frankly, I don't think we should let bureaucratic paperwork override what's right." The mediator frowned. "Without official documentation, it's difficult to give weight to this map. Do you have anything else to support your case?" Karen shifted uncomfortably but quickly recovered, her tone growing defensive. "The community knows what's right. I've spoken to several neighbors who agree with me. They've seen this land used as shared space for years. Ms. Hanks is new here. She doesn't understand how things work. Victoria felt her anger rising. I understand how property law works, and I understand that you've been trespassing and damaging my land. This has nothing to do with tradition or community, it's about you refusing to respect boundaries. Karen glared at her, but before she could respond, the mediator intervened. Let's keep this civil. Ms. Barlow, while I appreciate your perspective, the evidence presented by Ms. Hanks is far more compelling. Unless you can provide official documentation to support your claims, I don't see a basis for your argument. Karen's face turned red, and for a moment it seemed as though she might lash out. But then she composed herself, her voice taking on a more ominous tone. I see how it is, she said. You're siding with her because she has the paperwork. But this isn't over. I have a right to fight for what's mine. The mediator sighed. Ms. Barlow, I strongly advise you to reconsider your position. Continuing this dispute could lead to significant legal and financial consequences. Karen didn't respond. She simply gathered her things and stormed out of the room, leaving Victoria and the mediator in tense silence. After the meeting, Victoria felt a fleeting sense of relief. The mediator's conclusions were clear, and Karen's lack of evidence had exposed her claims for what they were baseless. But Victoria knew better than to assume the battle was won. Karen's parting words echoed in her mind. Over the next few days, the tension only grew. Victoria noticed new signs of Karen's defiance. Her dogs were once again roaming dangerously close to the fence, and strange piles of debris began appearing near the edges of her property. One morning, she found an old metal sign planted in her garden. The words "community property" were painted across it in bold, uneven letters. Victoria reported each incident to her attorney and filed additional complaints with the local authorities, but Karen's actions remained just subtle enough to avoid outright legal consequences. It was as though she was daring Victoria to make the next move, testing her resolve. The final straw came when Victoria woke up to find her gate wide open, the lock smashed. Her newly planted seedlings were torn from the soil, and fresh tire tracks cut deep into the ground. It was no longer just harassment, it was deliberate destruction. Victoria reviewed her security footage, hoping for clear evidence, and finally she had it. The grainy video showed Karen herself entering the property late at night, accompanied by someone else who appeared to be a hired worker. They tore through the garden, removed the lock, and left without a trace of remorse. Armed with this new evidence, Victoria met with her attorney to discuss the next steps. This changes everything, the attorney said. We can file for a restraining order immediately and begin building a case for damages. She's crossed the line. Victoria nodded, her determination hardening. Karen might have thought she could get away with her games, but this time she had gone too far. It was time to take the fight to the next level. Victoria didn't wait long to take action. Armed with the footage of Karen breaking onto her property and destroying her garden, she filed for an emergency restraining order the very next day. Her attorney assured her that the evidence was solid, and given the clear violation of her property rights, the court was likely to grant her request. But even as Victoria took these steps, she knew that Karen wasn't the type to back down quietly. There was a cunning relentlessness to her that made it clear she would find new ways to push the boundaries. What Victoria hadn't expected was just how far Karen was willing to go. 2 days after filing for the restraining order, Victoria returned home from a quick trip to town to find a large truck idling at the edge of her property. Several men in work boots and reflective vests were unloading equipment saws, stakes, and rolls of orange construction tape. As Victoria pulled her car into the driveway, she spotted Karen standing near the workers, barking instructions and gesturing toward the fence line. Victoria got out of her car and marched toward the group, her voice cutting through the noise of the unloading. What is going on here? Karen turned to face her, an exaggerated look of surprise plastered on her face. Oh, Victoria, you're back. I didn't think you'd be home this early. We're just getting started on the community project I told you about. Victoria stopped in her tracks, incredulous. What community project? You have no right to bring workers onto my land. Karen's expression shifted into something colder, more calculated. Actually, she said, holding up a folder, I have every right. This is an official permit from the county, granting us access to this section of the property. We're establishing a shared access pathway for the neighborhood. Victoria's heart dropped as Karen waved the folder smugly. For a moment, panic bubbled up inside her, but she forced herself to stay calm. Let me see that, she said, reaching for the folder. Karen hesitated, but eventually handed it over. As Victoria skimmed the document, her anger only grew. It was an official-looking form, filled with legal jargon, but something about it felt off. The details were vague, and the supposed permit lacked any signatures from the county officials she'd dealt with in the past. This isn't valid, Victoria said firmly, handing the folder back. You forged this? Karen's smile didn't waver. If you think that, feel free to call the county and check. But until you prove otherwise, we'll be proceeding as planned. Victoria's hands clenched into fists. She glanced at the workers, who were now carrying stakes toward the fence line. Get off my property, she said, her voice low but steady. Right now. One of the workers paused, looking uneasy, but Karen quickly stepped in. Ignore her, she told them. She's just trying to intimidate you. Everything we're doing here is completely legal. Victoria didn't waste any more time. She pulled out her phone, snapped several pictures of the workers, the truck, and Karen, and then dialed the sheriff's department. As she explained the situation, Karen crossed her arms and smirked, clearly unconcerned. When the sheriff's deputy arrived 20 minutes later, the tension was palpable. Victoria wasted no time presenting her evidence, showing the deputy the footage of Karen trespassing, the supposed permit, and the damage already caused to her garden. The deputy studied the permit carefully before turning to Karen. Ma'am, this document doesn't appear to be legitimate. Do you have any additional paperwork to support your claims? Karen's confidence faltered for the first time. This is all the paperwork I need, she said defensively. The community has been discussing this project for months. Everyone supports it. The deputy frowned. That may be, but without proper authorization, you can't conduct any work on someone else's property. I'm going to have to ask you and your workers to leave. Karen's face turned red with anger. This is ridiculous. She's the one who's in the wrong. This land has always been shared. But the deputy didn't budge. Reluctantly, Karen ordered the workers to pack up their equipment and leave. As the truck rumbled away, Karen turned to Victoria, her eyes blazing with fury. You think you've won, but this isn't over. You have no idea who you're messing with. Victoria didn't respond. She stood her ground, watching as Karen stormed back to her own property. Despite the small victory, Victoria felt the weight of the ongoing conflict pressing down on her. Karen wasn't just being difficult, she was escalating her tactics, and it was becoming clear that she would stop at nothing to claim what she thought was hers. Over the next week, the harassment continued in subtler but equally infuriating ways. Trash bags appeared near Victoria's driveway, torn open and spilling garbage across the gravel. The lock on her gate was tampered with again, leaving deep scratches around the keyhole. At one point, Victoria discovered strange markings spray-painted on the fence arrows pointing toward her garden, accompanied by cryptic letters that made no sense to her. Victoria reported each incident to the sheriff's department, but without concrete evidence tying Karen to the vandalism, there was little they could do beyond adding it to the growing list of complaints. Desperate for a way to protect her property, Victoria contacted a security company and arranged for additional cameras to be installed. These weren't just basic motion-activated devices, they were high-definition, with night vision and a wide field of view, designed to catch even the smallest movements along her fence line. It was a costly investment, but Victoria knew it was worth it. She wasn't going to let Karen intimidate her into giving up. One night, just as Victoria was beginning to feel a sense of control returning, the alarms on her new system went off. She rushed to her monitor and saw the live feed from one of the cameras. Two figures were crouched near the fence, cutting through the barbed wire she'd recently installed. Victoria's heart pounded as she called the sheriff's department, her voice urgent. They're here again. Two people, cutting through my fence. I have it on camera. The dispatcher assured her that deputies were on their way, but Victoria wasn't willing to sit back and wait. She grabbed a flashlight and a loud air horn she kept near the door, stepping out onto her porch. Shining the beam toward the fence, she shouted, "I see you. The police are on their way." The figures froze for a moment before scrambling to retreat, disappearing into the woods behind Karen's property. When the deputies arrived, Victoria showed them the footage, which clearly captured the intruders in the act. "This is enough to press charges," one of the deputies said, his tone serious. "We'll start an investigation." Victoria nodded, relief washing over her. For the first time, it felt like Karen's actions were finally catching up with her. But deep down, Victoria knew this was far from over. Karen wasn't just a nuisance, she was a threat. And Victoria would have to stay one step ahead if she wanted to protect her land and herself. The final breaking point came just a few days after the late-night trespassing incident. Victoria woke up early, as usual, to tend to her garden and check the perimeter of her property. When she stepped outside, however, she froze in disbelief. Her fence had been completely torn down along one section, and a series of large wooden stakes had been hammered into the ground. Bright orange construction tape was strung between them, zigzagging through her property like some hastily erected barrier. At the center of the chaos stood Karen, barking orders to a group of workers with shovels and wheelbarrows. They were digging up the soil in neat, deliberate rows, as though they were preparing the area for some sort of landscaping project. Victoria stormed toward them, her pulse pounding. "Karen," she shouted, her voice echoing across the field. "What the hell is this? Get off my property." Karen turned slowly, her expression a mask of smug confidence. "Good morning, Victoria," she said sweetly, as though they were merely neighbors exchanging pleasantries. "I'm afraid you're a little late to stop this. We've already begun construction on the community garden. Isn't it exciting? Soon, everyone will be able to enjoy this space." Victoria stared at her, struggling to process the audacity of what she was hearing. "You're trespassing," she said, her voice shaking with barely contained rage. "You've destroyed my fence, and now you're digging up my land. This isn't a community garden, it's my property." Karen's smile widened, but her eyes were cold. "Not for long," she said. "I've filed a petition to have this area reclassified as public land. Once it's approved, you won't have a say in how it's used." Victoria's hands clenched into fists. "You don't have the authority to reclassify anything. This is my land, and I have every legal document to prove it." Karen shrugged, clearly enjoying herself. "Legal documents don't mean much when the community is against you. You've made quite a name for yourself, selfish, uncooperative, unwilling to contribute. People are tired of you hoarding all this space. They've already signed petitions supporting me." For a moment, Victoria felt a pang of doubt. Could Karen really rally enough people to turn public opinion against her? But she quickly pushed the thought aside. Karen thrived on intimidation and manipulation, but Victoria wasn't about to let her win. "You're delusional," Victoria said firmly. "This isn't going to work. I've already filed a restraining order against you, and I'm reporting this to the police right now." Karen's expression darkened. "You think you're so clever, don't you?" she said, her voice low and venomous. "You think you can just push me around because you have a piece of paper saying this land is yours. But I've lived here my whole life, Victoria. I know how things work, and I'm not going anywhere." Without waiting for a response, Karen turned back to the workers, waving her hand dismissively. "Keep digging," she ordered. Victoria's fury boiled over. She pulled out her phone and began recording everything: the workers tearing up her soil, Karen barking orders, and the destroyed remains of her fence. Then she called the sheriff's department, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. By the time the deputies arrived, Karen had already begun spinning her version of events. She greeted them with an air of practiced innocence, claiming that she was acting on behalf of the community and that Victoria had agreed to let her use the land. "She's just upset because she changed her mind," Karen said with a shrug. "But we've already started, and I have the support of the neighborhood." Victoria cut in sharply. "That's a lie. I never agreed to anything. She's trespassing, and I have proof." The deputies listened carefully as Victoria presented her evidence: the security footage of Karen's earlier trespassing, the restraining order, and the pictures and video she had just taken of the destruction. One of the deputies examined the stakes and construction tape, shaking his head. "This is serious," he said, turning to Karen. "You're not authorized to be here, and you've clearly violated the restraining order. We're going to need you to leave the property immediately." Karen's face turned red with fury. "You can't do this," she shouted. "This isn't fair. She doesn't even belong here. She's just some outsider who doesn't understand how things are done." The deputy remained calm but firm. "Ma'am, if you don't leave voluntarily, we'll have to escort you off the property. And you may want to consult with your lawyer because this is no longer just a civil matter." For a moment, Karen looked as though she might refuse, but the weight of the deputy's presence and the clear evidence against her finally broke through her defiance. She spun on her heel and stormed away, shouting threats over her shoulder. "You haven't won, Victoria. This isn't over." Victoria watched her go, a mixture of relief and exhaustion washing over her. The deputy stayed long enough to take a full report and document the damage, assuring Victoria that charges would likely be filed against Karen for violating the restraining order and trespassing. As they drove away, Victoria stood in the middle of her field, surveying the mess Karen had left behind. The stakes and tape were still scattered across the ground, a stark reminder of how far her neighbor had been willing to go. But for the first time in weeks, Victoria felt a glimmer of hope. Karen's schemes were unraveling, and the law was finally catching up with her. It wasn't a clean victory. There was still a long road ahead to repair the damage and rebuild the fence, but it was a step in the right direction. Victoria knew that Karen wouldn't give up easily, but she also knew that she was stronger than Karen had anticipated. As the sun began to set, Victoria picked up one of the broken stakes and tossed it into a pile of debris. "Not on my watch," she muttered, her resolve stronger than ever. In the days following Karen's removal from her property, Victoria threw herself into repairing the damage left behind. The sight of torn soil and the remains of the fence was a constant reminder of how far things had escalated. But rather than feeling defeated, she channeled her frustration into action. She called a trusted contractor to begin rebuilding the fence, this time with reinforced steel posts and heavy-duty materials that would be nearly impossible to destroy. The local deputies followed up with a visit to inform her that charges had officially been filed against Karen for violating the restraining order and trespassing. Hearing this news brought a sense of vindication, though Victoria knew it wasn't the end of the battle. Legal proceedings could take months, if not longer, and Karen had already proven that she wasn't afraid to bend the rules. For the first time, however, the tables seemed to be turning. Victoria noticed a shift in the attitude of her neighbors. Those who had once avoided her or stayed neutral were now reaching out, apologizing for their silence. One older man, who had been particularly distant, stopped by with a gift basket of fresh vegetables from his garden. "I wasn't sure what to believe before," he admitted, his voice heavy with regret. "Karen's good at convincing people, but after seeing the mess she made, it's clear she was in the wrong. I just wanted to say I'm sorry for not standing up sooner." Victoria accepted his apology with a gracious smile. She didn't hold any grudges. It was enough that people were beginning to see Karen for who she truly was. Karen, meanwhile, had gone unusually quiet. Her house sat dark and lifeless, with no signs of her usual activity. Victoria suspected that the legal trouble, combined with her public embarrassment, had finally forced her into retreat. Rumors began circulating that Karen was planning to sell her property and leave town, though Victoria didn't dare celebrate until she saw it for herself. As weeks passed, Victoria's life gradually returned to normal. The fence was fully restored, the garden replanted, and the cameras repositioned to cover every angle of the property. She felt a newfound sense of security, knowing that she had taken every precaution to prevent future incidents. One evening, as she sat on her porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, she spotted a moving truck pulling up to Karen's house. Workers began loading boxes and furniture into the back, their movements hurried and methodical. Victoria stayed seated, watching silently as Karen emerged, speaking briefly to the movers before disappearing back inside. There was no dramatic confrontation, no parting words of defiance. Karen's departure was quiet and unceremonious, a stark contrast to the chaos she had caused. For Victoria, it felt like the closing of a chapter. In the following days, Victoria took steps to strengthen her connections within the community. She invited neighbors over for coffee, sharing her vision for the farm as a sustainable haven for rare crops and education. Slowly but surely, she began rebuilding trust and forging new friendships. Despite the challenges she had faced, Victoria felt a sense of pride and accomplishment. She had stood her ground against Karen's schemes, not by sinking to her level, but by using reason, persistence, and the law. The experience had changed her not just as a landowner, but as a person. As she walked through her garden one morning, admiring the rows of fresh seedlings, Victoria felt a deep sense of peace. The farm, once a symbol of her grandfather's legacy, had become her own. It wasn't just a place to live, it was a testament to her resilience and determination. Karen was gone, her threats silenced, and the land was finally quiet again. For the first time in months, Victoria allowed herself to exhale, knowing she had done everything in her power to protect her home. The fight had been worth it, and now she could finally begin the next chapter of her life.